Am I the asshole for leaving my friend behind after he stopped taking my depression seriously? I remember the hallway light catching just like it was trying to tell me something, and I remember Finn laughing in the doorway, the way he used to squint when he was reading my moods like a map, but that night the map tore and I just kept walking still. I don't open with an explanation because there wasn't one that made sense on its own. There was only a steady tightening that had been happening for months, a weight that made the world muffled and the words slippery, and Finn was the person who used to notice when I went quiet, who'd nudge me with a joke or a stupid question until I'd surface enough to breathe, so I trusted him like a lifeline without really naming it. Then, like a small, stupid thing that becomes a pattern, he'd started answering the bad days with this laugh that wasn't kind. He'd say I was being dramatic. He'd roll his eyes when I tried to tell him how I couldn't get out of bed, like my reality was an overplayed scene he was bored of. At first I told myself he didn't mean it, that he was tired or distracted. Maybe he'd been raised in a family where feelings were shrugged off. Maybe it was ignorance, not malice. But the thing with ignorance is how it sits there and gets comfortable if no one pushes back. I pushed back. I tried to explain more than once in that halting way you do when the words are sticky. I told him about the mornings that felt like climbing with an invisible pack of rocks, about the nights my chest was a room full of static, and he would pull that face like he was being inconvenienced, like my honesty was an assault on his evening. It didn't feel like him anymore. It felt like a new Finn who preferred tidy, easy versions of things. So the distance built out of those tiny betrayals, not one huge blow but a cumulative erosion, and I started moving through school like I was half a step outside my life, watching everyone else from the rim of a pool I could no longer find the courage to jump into. That was my headspace the night at the party when he said, loud enough for people to hear, "It's all in your head, just snap out of it," and laughed like it was a punchline. Boom. That ridiculous, casual dismissal landed in my chest like an actual physical thing, and I couldn't move with him anymore, couldn't pretend. I walked away in the middle of everything, no dramatic speech, no confrontation, just my feet in the hallway and the street lamp outside that made everything look too honest. There was this precise, awful clarity in the act of leaving. I wasn't safe with him, not in the ways that mattered. His version of concern had been replaced by impatience, and I didn't have the energy to teach him how to care. After that, we barely spoke. He messaged once or twice, trying the same old jokes, and I answered with short, careful things because I wasn't sure if I was protecting myself or being childish. People asked me later if I felt guilty, if I regretted it, and the question felt like a hand probing a bruise. Part of me ached for the friendship because it had been real once, late study sessions, sharing headphones, the small code words we used when we needed to bail, but another part of me felt relieved, like a skin that had been rubbing raw finally had room to heal. When I told my mom about it later, she said maybe I was too young to walk away, that friendships weather hard times and you forgive, but she also said your mental health isn't a thing to be footnoted. I couldn't decide which of those was right. Sometimes I replay small scenes, his face when I tried to tell him about swallowing my pills and feeling like they were paper, the way his eyebrows went up and he said, "You're being dramatic," like he was delivering a diagnosis he found amusing, and I feel a purge of shame that I ever expected him to understand. Other times I remember him being the one who'd sit with me on the library roof when no one else noticed I was gone, and that memory makes the loss sting in a softer, more complicated way. The part that haunts me most is the silence after I left. There's a blankness where a whole history used to be. An absence is an everyday kind of ache that becomes part of your routine. I don't know if I ruined the last real friendship I had, or if I finally did a small, necessary thing to keep myself whole. I only know I couldn't keep volunteering my pain for someone who treated it like a performance. Maybe there's room for both truths. Maybe I both protected myself and cut off a person who might have grown into the friend I needed, had he been given the chance. Right now I'm learning how to sit with that uncertainty without forcing an answer, which is awkward and slow and feels like homework I never asked for. If I could go back, I'd tell the version of me who just walked away to say one hard sentence first. I need you to listen like it matters. But that would be asking space and empathy from someone who had already shown he couldn't give them, and asking for a thing you can't get from someone is how you end up hollow. So I keep moving through school, through the small rituals that stitch a day together, occasionally seeing Finn in the corridors and feeling my throat close like it's holding a secret. Sometimes I catch him watching me, and there's that old flicker, curiosity or regret, and I don't know what either of us would do if we spoke. People tell me to forgive him, to reach out, to heal the cracked plate, but forgiveness feels like a tool, and I'm not sure I want to hand it over while the wound is still raw. Other people say I should have stayed and tried harder, that relationships deserve work, but work implies mutual effort, and the last time I invested all my energy into explaining and got a shrug in return, I learned that effort can be a one-way street that leaves you exhausted. So I oscillate, one day thinking I saved myself, another thinking I selfishly closed the only door to someone who'd once been my anchor. The truth is messy. Leaving felt like survival in real time, and in time survival becomes its own kind of loner art, but it also teaches you what kinds of people you need around you. I'm not asking for a verdict. I want to tell you honestly that walking away was both the most adult and the most afraid thing I did. I protected myself from someone who laughed when I said I might die. I also shelved a friendship with a billion small, good memories. That contradiction is the point I live with now, and I think it's allowed, painful, confusing, allowed. I stayed quiet for years, then finally told the truth about my teacher's secret. I remember the first time Ms. Naidu smiled at me like it was a small, dangerous thing. Like someone had given me permission to breathe in a room I thought I had to hold my breath in forever. She taught English, and she had that way of talking where every sentence landed like she already knew what you were thinking. Students leaned in naturally, and parents nodded at school events like she was the kind of person you could hand your kid to and feel lighter afterward. I didn't speak about the thing I saw because who was I, really, to point out a crack in that kind of confidence, and because there was a softer, cowardly part of me that thought becoming the problem would be worse than staying quiet. I learned to sit at the back of the classroom and watch her move the room, how she rearranged chairs with a measured impatience, how she laughed at jokes she didn't quite mean, how she touched the chalk between her fingers like it was a tiny, urgent secret. People trusted her immediately. She trusted easily, seemed to trust the world so that trusting her felt like the sensible thing to do. That certainty of hers should have settled me, but instead it made me feel like I was the only one carrying weather under my shirt. The first years I put a name to what I felt. I didn't speak it aloud because words add weight, and I was tired of being heavier than air. I told myself stories, that I was overreacting, that I wanted attention, that I was inventing things because kids make up dramas. So I folded the noticing in on itself and made a neat little packet of observations I never opened. There were tiny things that by themselves sounded like nothing. How she lingered at the doorway after class, how she said good boy to some of the boys differently, how she would call one of us into the corridor for feedback and look at us like she saw a private weather map we weren't supposed to see. They were fragments, and fragments make bad evidence because they can be rearranged into innocence just as easily as guilt. But fragments stacked. The way she kept a drawer of snacks and handed them with an edge of ownership, the way she would drop a look like a question and then answer it in a half smile that slotted into silence. Once you start cataloging a pattern, it becomes harder to pretend the pattern isn't real. I used to watch her at school functions, and there was a choreography to it: pose, ease, scan for soft places, close in, and I kept thinking that a professional person doesn't move like this, not if they're being professional. I also knew she liked to read us poems about quiet courage and then tell us very gently that some truths are about staying steady, not loud. That line made me feel smaller than I already was, like the courage she praised was precisely the thing that would keep me silent. The day it became impossible to keep pretending wasn't dramatic. It was a stupid, ordinary Tuesday with rain under the classroom windows and the hum of the fluorescent lights feeling like a second sky. She asked me to stay after because I'd turned in an essay that had comedic edge and she wanted to talk craft. I stayed because what else do you do when a teacher calls you to speak in private? You go. You keep your eyes on your handwriting like it matters. We sat at the desk by the window and she leaned forward as if reading me personally, and then she did that thing where she touched my wrist, not hard, not like an attack, but with a pressure that asked if my skin agreed to this conversation. My pulse went raw and immediate, and for a second I couldn't tell if the feeling was from years of holding things in or from whatever she was doing now. She complimented my language and then, almost like an apology, began telling me about her own younger self, about a boy who used to stare at her in math class, about boundaries that were muddy when you were small. The story should have been a warning, but instead it felt like confessional homework. She said, "You have this look, Caleb, like you're always trying not to be noticed, but there are ways to be noticed that save you and ways that trap you." I wanted to stand, to run, to laugh at the absurdity of being singled out for something I hadn't volunteered for. I said nothing. Later, she gave me a folded note with an address and a time for a writing workshop. She was running on Saturdays, small group, safe space, she called it. I didn't go the first time because I had reasons: schoolwork, a movie, a dentist appointment I made up that sounded plausible. I didn't go the second time either because absence is its own protection. You can refuse someone power by refusing their stage. But the note kept returning like rain, left in my bag, slipped under my door, placed on my desk with a smile that said, "I know where you are even when you're not looking." The thing that finally broke me was that she did it to Adrian, the way she spoke to him in front of class, how she corrected his hair with a hand that stayed on his shoulder too long, how she followed him down the corridor once and then laughed when he brushed past. Adrian is louder than me, people call him a character, and he has a shrug that seems to erase awkwardness. But he stopped eating lunch and he started coming late, and the brightness that used to bounce off him dulled into a small, brittle thing. One week we were selling tickets for the school play, and she came up to our table with a script folded under her arm and barked something about commitment while looking at Adrian like he was an inside joke. Later in the stairwell, I heard Adrian whisper to Finn about the workshop and how she just wanted to talk, man, and his voice cut like a dull blade when he said, "I felt weird in there." That word, weird, is small and clumsy, but it carried a load that didn't fit in its syllables. I could have stayed quiet and let him carry it. I could have pretended I didn't see the way he avoided my eyes. Instead, something loosened. It wasn't bravery. It's never a single moment where you become heroic. It's a slow, annoying unraveling of excuses. I told the guidance counselor first because telling the school felt like a safer step than telling the world. The counselor listened and took notes with a steady hand, like she was building a bridge across our small, trembling testimonies. Then we told our parents. My mom didn't cry. She was blunt and efficient and went into action like a machine made of love. Adrian's dad drove to the school that afternoon and asked to speak with the principal. It spread in the only way these things do, quietly, then all at once. Staff rooms have a way of clearing themselves when certain conversations start. People shuffle, expressions change, and Ms. Nadu's smile became a contraption that didn't fit anymore. We had meetings, several of them, in rooms with impossible linoleum floors and fluorescent lights that made everyone look honest and tired. They asked me to recount incidents, to place dates and times around my memories like pins on a map. I spoke because the map needed to be finished, and because the weight of not speaking had been like a stone I carried in my sneakers. My words weren't polished, they were thick with distance and shame and relief. Afterward, there was an investigation and a suspension, and a statement that the school made to parents about protecting students' welfare. People treated me differently for a while, like I had done something too big for my years. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I felt like someone had removed one small, constant pressure from inside my chest, and now I could breathe without planning it. It didn't feel like heroism. It was simply lighter, like I had stopped holding my breath for the first time in years. The hardest parts came later, the flashbacks that arrived in grocery stores, the difficulty of trusting authority like educators, the nights when I'd wake with my face wet and no clear reason why. But there were also small mercies, Adrian laughing again, the way my mother kissed my forehead when I came home from school, the way Finn would slide a comic onto my desk like nothing big had happened. I learned that silence is not always nobility. Sometimes it's a weight you mistake for modesty until it presses you flat. Telling the truth didn't make me feel brave in the way novels say bravery looks. It just made me human-sized again, which was enough. I still see Ms. Nadu in hallways sometimes, and the thing between us is no longer invisible. It's a careful, functional distance that hums with what wasn't said. I don't think about revenge or about dramatic confrontations. I think about the small, steady work of rebuilding trust in people who deserve it and keeping an eye open for patterns, not because I'm suspicious by nature, but because I don't want anyone else to carry a quiet weight that steals their air.
My roommate next door wasn't who they said they were. I moved into that apartment thinking I was finally getting a clean break from everything that had been swallowing me whole. New place, new rent, new silence. That was the plan, anyway. The first week felt almost weirdly calm, like I'd been handed a tiny pocket of peace and told not to mess it up. My roommate, if you could even call them that at first, stayed in the unit next door and kept to themselves so hard I started wondering if they were ever even home. I'd hear the front door click open at odd hours, soft as a held breath, and then nothing. No music, no phone calls, no TV, just that cold, empty quiet that made the walls feel too thin. At first, I told myself I was being dramatic. I was already tired all the time, already running on too little sleep and too many bad thoughts, so it was easy to blame my own head. But then the notes started. Little scraps of paper on the kitchen counter, on my door handle, once even tucked under the sugar jar. You didn't eat dinner. Try water first. Leave the light on tonight. Short things. Creepy things. Things that sounded gentle if you didn't think too hard about them. Seriously. The first time I found one, I laughed, because what else was I supposed to do? The second time, I didn't laugh at all. I just stood there in my socks, staring at the handwriting like it might start explaining itself. The worst part was that they always seemed to know when I was falling apart. On the days when I could barely drag myself out of bed, there'd be tea outside my door. On the mornings, I'd wake up with my chest tight and my hands shaking. There'd be toast wrapped in foil, still warm. Once, after I cried so hard in the bathroom I thought I might throw up, I came out and found a blanket folded on my couch like someone had been there watching the whole time. I should have felt cared for. Instead, I felt exposed. It was like living beside a shadow that knew my habits better than I did. I asked them about it once, as casually as I could manage. Their name, they'd told me, was Daniel. They were tall, quiet, and always dressed like they were trying to disappear into the wall. They shrugged when I held up the note. I noticed things, they said. That was it. No smile. No apology. Just those flat eyes on me, calm as anything. It should have made me angry. Instead, it made my skin prickle. Because how did they know I hadn't eaten? How did they know I hadn't slept? How did they know the exact nights when I was one bad thought away from doing something stupid? Then they vanished for 3 days. No knock, no note, no tea, nothing. I remember pacing my apartment on the second night, telling myself I didn't care. But I did care. I cared too much, which is honestly my biggest problem. I kept checking the hall, staring at their closed door, listening for movement. By the third morning, I'd convinced myself something awful had happened. When they finally came back, it was just after midnight. I was sitting on the kitchen floor because my couch had started to feel like a place where all the bad parts of my life collected. I heard the key in the lock and stood up so fast my knees cracked. Daniel walked in carrying 2 grocery bags and looked surprised to see me awake. Not guilty, not scared, just surprised. "You've been gone," I said. They set the bags down. Yeah, that was all. I waited for more, for some explanation, some crack in the wall. Instead, they started putting groceries away like we were talking about weather. I remember staring at their hands and thinking, no normal person moves like that after disappearing for 3 days. No normal person leaves their roommate food and then vanishes without a word. My stomach went cold. The next morning, I did something I'm not proud of. I checked the mailbox downstairs because I'd seen Daniel come in with envelopes that weren't addressed to our unit. One had a logo I didn't recognize. Another was in a plain white envelope with no return name. I opened the one with the logo first because I was already past pretending I wasn't curious. It wasn't for Daniel. It was for someone named Daniela. Same apartment number, Same pickup instructions. Same last 4 digits on a payment form I'd never seen before. My hands started shaking so hard I almost dropped it. I went back upstairs and looked around their room while they were in the shower. I know how that sounds. I do. But once you've started feeling like a stranger in your own home, curiosity turns into survival. Their desk was covered in stacked receipts, 3 phones charging at once, and a notebook full of names. Not contacts, names, addresses too. A lot of them had dates beside them. A few had little marks like checkboxes. I found my own name on the 3rd page. Just my first name, Grace. Under it was written, sleep poor, checks door twice, avoids dinner, needs daylight. I couldn't breathe for a second. It felt like the room tipped sideways. I kept reading, because apparently I like pain in the most efficient form possible. There were notes on me going back weeks. When I had panic attacks, when I skipped meals, when I called my aunt and pretended I was fine, when I cried in the dark and then turned on the TV so I wouldn't hear myself. They knew everything, everything. I was still standing there when the shower stopped. I shoved the notebook back where I found it and walked out like my legs were made of glass. My heart was beating so hard I thought they'd hear it through the wall. And when Daniel came out, hair damp, shirt half-buttoned, they looked right at my face and said, "You found it." No denial, no shock, just that. I asked who they were. Really who? Not the name on the lease. Not the version they'd handed me like a mask. Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed and rubbed a hand over their mouth. And for the first time, they looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I wasn't watching you to hurt you," they said. "I was trying to make sure you stayed here." That made no sense, so of course I asked why. Their answer still makes my stomach turn. They said I'd been here before, not in this apartment, but in their life. Years ago, different city, different name. They said they'd seen me at my worst then too, back when I was too far gone to remember people who tried to help me. They changed their own name after that. Changed everything. Then they found me again when I moved in next door, and they thought maybe this time they could keep me from disappearing for good. I didn't know whether to scream or cry. I still don't. The thing is, they were right about some of it. I had been disappearing in every way that mattered, but I never asked them to build a whole secret life around me. I never asked to be studied like a weather pattern. And the strangest part, I believed them enough to hate them for it. That's what got me. Not the lies, not even the notebooks. It was the way they'd seen me falling apart and decided I belonged to their rescue plan. I moved out a week later, quietly. No scene, just boxes, tape, and my life stuffed into the back of a borrowed car. Daniel stood in the hallway when I left, looking like they wanted to say something and didn't trust themselves to try. I almost asked one question. Almost. Who was watching whom? But I didn't. I just walked out and kept walking, even with my skin still buzzing from the truth. And ever since then, whenever I hear a door click shut in the dark, I remember the notes, the tea, the notebook with my name inside it, and the awful, tender fact that someone can care about you so hard it starts to feel like a trap. My boss tried to ruin my life, so I destroyed theirs legally. The first time he called me emotional, I was standing in the break room with my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped my tea. He just told me, in front of 2 coworkers, that I was too sensitive for this kind of pressure. And maybe I should think about whether I was really cut out for the job. I remember looking at the floor tiles, trying to breathe like my therapist taught me, because I could feel the spiral starting in my chest, and I did not want him to see me break. He liked that part, I think. He liked getting under my skin and then acting surprised when it showed. It started small, a comment here, a fake concern there. Then my hours got cut. Not officially, not in a way anyone could point to right away, just enough that my paycheck started shrinking, and I had to choose between groceries and my bus pass. When I asked about it, he gave me that pitying smile and said, "You've been having a hard time lately, Amina. I'm just trying to be fair to the team." Fair, sure. That word made me want to laugh and scream at the same time. But I didn't scream. I went quiet. That was the first thing I did right. I stopped giving him reactions. I stopped defending myself in the moment. I started writing everything down. Dates, times, who was there, what he said, what he changed. I kept screenshots. I saved schedules. I forwarded emails to my personal account. I wrote down the days he made little jokes about my mood after I disclosed my depression in confidence, because I had trusted him like an idiot, and he treated that trust like a weapon he could swing around whenever he wanted. It got worse when he figured out I wasn't going to quit. He started twisting mistakes that weren't mine. If the inventory count was off, it was somehow my fault. If a customer complained, he'd ask if I'd had a rough morning again. If I needed a day off for an appointment, he'd roll his eyes and say I was unreliable. Unreliable. That word stuck in my head for weeks. I'd lie awake replaying every shift, every conversation, every tiny humiliation, wondering if maybe I really was failing. Depression does that. It makes you doubt your own memory, your own body, your own name. He counted on that. He counted on me being too tired to fight back and too ashamed to ask for help. But I wasn't alone, even when I felt like it. Tasha noticed first. She caught him lowering my hours and asked me why I looked like I hadn't slept in a week. Lena noticed the way he changed his tone when he spoke to me, all sweet poison and fake patience. I didn't tell them everything at once. I couldn't. It felt embarrassing, like admitting I'd been drowning in a puddle. But little by little, I let them see enough. They started saving things too. They told me when he made comments about my attitude in meetings. They sent me the schedule screenshots when he shifted shifts without notice. One afternoon, he called me into his office and closed the door like he was doing me a favor. He leaned back in his chair and told me very calmly that maybe I should consider whether this environment was healthy for me. Then he said, and I'll never forget this, people have to be realistic about their limitations. I think that was the moment I stopped seeing him as just cruel and started seeing him as stupid because he wasn't even being careful anymore. He truly believed nobody would ever challenge him. So I let him keep talking. I nodded. I said I understood. I even thanked him for his feedback. And he looked so pleased with himself, it made my skin crawl. Then I went home and added every word to my log. Every single one. My Aunt Brenda told me to keep going, keep it clean, keep it legal. And for once in my life, I listened before I exploded. I found out the labor rules. I checked my contract. I wrote a timeline that made the pattern impossible to ignore. Not one bad day. Not one misunderstanding. A pattern. Targeting. Retaliation. Different language in public. Different language in private. Different treatment after I disclosed a health issue. I sent the packet to HR first because I wanted to give them a chance to do the right thing before I burned the whole place down in a way that would follow me forever. They tried to stall. Of course they did. They said they'd look into it. They said they appreciated my candor. I almost threw my phone across the room. So I waited one more week, and when nothing happened, I sent the full file to the regional director, the compliance officer, and the external labor contact listed in our policy. Clean copies. No drama, just receipts. Boom. The response came fast after that. Faster than I expected, honestly. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk to me. Suddenly, the same people who had acted like I was overreacting were asking for exact dates, and exact times, and exact screenshots. My boss started pacing through the office like he'd swallowed glass. He tried to corner me in the hallway and whisper that I was making this personal. Personal. That was rich coming from a man who had built half his workday around humiliating me. I told him loud enough for two people to hear that I wasn't making anything personal. I was documenting what he did. His face changed right there, like instant panic. The best part, he had no answer. None. Because he'd spent months counting on my silence, and silence was over. By the end of the month, his authority was gone. First, the schedule changed. Then, he was removed from managing our team. Then he was in meetings with people who did not laugh at his jokes. And you could tell that wrecked him more than any formal warning ever could. I kept my job. My hours came back. The people who'd watched him treat me like I was disposable started looking at him like he was the one who didn't belong there. That part mattered more than I expected. Not revenge. Not even the apology, which I never got. It was the look on everyone's faces when they realized I hadn't been too sensitive at all. I'd been right. Every time. And he knew it. He knew it when he tried to cut me down. And he knew it when the paper trail came back to bite him. I didn't destroy him with a scene. I destroyed him with proof. Quietly. Legally. Completely. And honestly, that felt better than yelling ever would.
My boss tried to ruin my life, so I destroyed theirs legally. I knew the first time he called me unreliable out loud in front of the team that something had shifted. It wasn't just a bad day, it was a pattern he was trying to make stick, and I felt the room close around me like a hand pushing me down. I kept working because what else could I do? But I started doing the quiet, boring things that feel like armor. saving every email, jotting dates into a notebook, recording times and the words he used. Because when you live with that low hum of depression, you already know people will call you flaky and mean it. So I did the slow work, the only kind of work that felt safe, documentation, while pretending I wasn't assembling evidence the way someone else might tidy photographs after a fight. At meetings, he'd smile and make a joke that cut, or he'd mark my calendar as missed, while I had doctor's notes filed, and each time I felt smaller. I told myself I was being careful, but inside I was furious the way someone gets furious when they're scared they'll stop existing in other people's eyes. I didn't tell many people. This persona inside me is the one who learned to be invisible because showing weakness used to make me a target. And my older sister's voice lived in my head saying I was always the lesser one, which made me hold everything inward and keep meticulous proof instead of shouting about it. The proof piled up into a small mountain. Emails where he'd rewrite my contributions as problems, HR requests that vanished, performance notes with the wrong dates, a meeting where he claimed I'd missed a deadline that I'd emailed him about, attachments proving otherwise. It felt like stacking stones until I had a wall I could point at. I worked with a therapist, which meant there were official notes and documentation I could use to show I'd asked for reasonable accommodations. I'd asked twice for small shifts and a check-in, and each time he shrugged them off or said, "We all have bad days." It hurt because the company had policies that should have protected me, but policies are words until someone presses them into action, and he was good at pressing the story that fit him, unreliable label, until people started to believe it as if it had always been true. So I kept that wall of evidence and waited until it mattered. I didn't want a petty fight, I wanted the truth to be undeniable. I remember the night I finally handed the files to HR like a soldier passing contraband over the border. My hands shook, and every part of me expected them to laugh or to file it away like they had the other requests. But HR opened the files, they read the emails, they noticed the timestamps and the mismatched notes, and the whole neat little narrative he'd been weaving started to unravel in front of them. They interviewed me and then quietly interviewed him, and I watched his face go from confident to thinly polite to finally exposed in a way I'd only ever imagined in daydreams where things actually go right. He'd been setting me up, misattributing my sick days, inventing missed deadlines, nudging colleagues to remember instances that never happened. And the pattern was there, clean and damning, because I had been the only person who believed the documentation mattered enough to keep. When they ran through the emails and compared his calendar notes to my saved messages, they couldn't reconcile the stories, and the company started to take the steps they hadn't when I had first asked. The irony stung. Winning didn't make the months of isolation go away. It only proved I hadn't been crazy. Watching him get called into meetings, watching his power wobble and finally be taken away, felt like watching a movie where the villain trips on his own lies. Satisfying, yes, but not the balm I thought it might be. Being vindicated didn't erase the loneliness. It didn't fill the long, quiet weekends where I replayed conversations and wondered if I had overreacted or been too sensitive. I still felt small sometimes, because the habit of believing I was always on the outside had been trained into me since childhood by a sister who made winning at attention an art form. Yet the legal and formal dismantling of his narrative gave me something else, a ledger that proved reality. It let me say to myself, in plain terms, "You were right to protect yourself." That sentence matters when the default voice in your head is one that tells you you're making things up. HR's actions, formal reprimands, corrected records, and an administrative review of his conduct shifted the company's internal memory of me. They couldn't undo the things he'd said, but they could correct the record and, more importantly, stop him from using his position to weaponize my mental health against me again. There's a bureaucratic kind of justice in that. It isn't explosive, it isn't cinematic, it's a relabeling of facts so you can go to future reviewers and say, "This is what happened," and have them look at the files and nod at the rumor. For someone who spent years shrinking, that mattered in a way that's hard to name. People ask why I didn't go to HR earlier or why I didn't quit. They'd expect simpler answers like I wanted revenge or I couldn't handle it. The truth was more complicated. I wanted stability and also proof. I wanted to see whether the system would notice and act if I presented clear evidence, because I had learned to expect dismissal. I wanted my future references to be unpoisoned. I wanted the register of my work to actually reflect the work. So I did the adult, tedious thing, built the paper trail, while also doing everything else at my job, and it split me into two selves, one who performed normality and one who cataloged every slight for months. There's a small, bitter pride in that kind of persistence, not flashy but durable. When the company finally acknowledged the pattern and corrected the records, it didn't feel like applause. It felt like permission to keep existing as myself at work without his shadow over everything. The aftermath is messy. He was moved out of our direct chain of command and later left the company after an internal review that couldn't justify keeping him. My coworkers who hadn't seen the private side started to treat me differently, not with warmth exactly, but with a new steadiness, like they had finally got the memo that I wasn't the problem. My therapist told me I did exactly what someone should do when facing repeated gaslighting: document, set boundaries, and escalate through proper channels. Those words were small comfort and also true. They turned a chaotic, humiliating experience into evidence for structural change. I still have to manage my days, because depression doesn't pack up when vindication arrives, but I don't have to carry the extra weight of being told I'm unreliable when I'm not. The company changed its documentation process too, which feels less personal and more like the world learning a rule that protects other people the way I wish someone had protected me earlier. If there's a lesson in this, it's not about winning a battle. It's about what the slow, careful work of protection can do when systems are imperfect but not blind. If you're living with something that makes you feel exposed, especially a mental health condition, hold tightly to any official records you can, ask for accommodations in writing, and don't underestimate the power of small, steady proof. It won't always feel empowering while you're doing it. It's often exhausting and humiliating. But it can change outcomes, and sometimes that's the only kind of justice that will keep you safe in the long run. I stayed quiet for years, then finally told the truth about my teacher's secret. I remember the first time I saw it, nothing dramatic, just a look that made my stomach drop and my throat dry like I'd swallowed a stone. I was in the back of the classroom because that's where I mostly lived, where people couldn't see me too clearly and the world felt a touch less hostile, and Mrs. Patel called my name with that soft, practiced smile she used for everyone and then kept talking to Sam like he was the only person in the room, like he was the only person who mattered. It was a small thing, I know, but to me it felt like a gasp, like oxygen being taken away, and I sat very still because I'd learned to be still, to tuck myself away so I wouldn't take up space. At home, Ava would point out my silence as if it were proof I deserved less. "You're always so weirdly quiet, Zoe," and she'd laugh in that way that made people look and then look away. And by the time I walked into school the next morning, I had this knot that lived between my shoulders, like I'd been carrying a pebble in my bra all night. The pebble grew heavier over the years. It started as moments. Mrs. Patel bending a little too long over Sam's paper, Sam laughing a little too loud at things no one else found funny, the way Mrs. Patel's emails would suddenly change tone when she wrote to his mother. And I told myself I was seeing things because what else do you do when everyone else is smiling and making it seem normal? Seriously, I was the awkward girl who always looked upset. People thought I overreacted. Boom. That tag kept me quiet because who would believe me? Who would listen to the girl who always avoided eye contact and wore her cardigan like armor? The answer came later, but for a long time it was silence and swallowing and nights spent replaying small scenes and trying to make them mean nothing. One afternoon changed me. It wasn't cinematic, it was ordinary. I was in the corridor, books slipping in my arms, when I overheard Mrs. Patel telling Sam that she'd handle it and to just trust her. And she put her hand on his shoulder like they shared a secret. I felt like someone had opened a vein inside me. I could feel everything at once: fear, the old, familiar shrinking, and a ridiculous, fierce anger that shocked me because I wasn't supposed to be angry. I was supposed to be invisible. So I started paying attention. I kept notes in my head, small timestamps that I thought no one would ever need. The way she'd mark his test leniently, how she'd let him hand in late work with a smile, how she'd explain away his rudeness as creative or misunderstood. I remembered the day Sam pushed me in the stairwell and Mrs. Patel said nothing even though I nearly fell, and the knot tightened. It was easier to pretend it was nothing when I was alone with it, because admitting it aloud meant risking ridicule, and I'd learned that people prefer their tidy stories where teachers are kind and students are complicated but forgivable. But the pebble had become a rock. One evening, I found myself scrolling through old messages on my phone, and there, between memes and study reminders, were screenshots I'd taken of messages Sam had sent to a friend bragging about favors Mrs. Patel did for him. He called her mine in a way that made my teeth ache. I kept them because part of me hoped I was wrong, the rest of me knew I was. I told no one. I rehearsed telling no one. Then the day came when Sam crossed a line so clear it felt criminal. He cornered Nia behind the gym, and Nia ran to me trembling, eyes wide like she'd seen a ghost, and she said words that made the room tilt. Words about being asked to keep quiet, about promises, about feeling trapped. I listened, and a door in me slammed open. The rock inside me finally had somewhere to fall. I remember the moment I made the decision. This is real, I thought, and real things demand action, even if your hands shake. I went to the guidance office with my phone in my pocket, screenshots, and a voice memo I'd recorded without thinking one night when I heard Mrs. Patel on a call saying, "This will be okay," in a voice that sounded too intimate for a professional. Walking down that corridor felt like walking through molasses. Ava's voice telling me to stay out of things echoed in my head, but Ava didn't know what it was to feel unsafe in the place that was supposed to teach you to be brave. The counselor listened, which surprised me, and then she didn't look surprised at all. She looked heavy, like someone carrying news she'd hoped never to need. They said they'd investigate, and I felt a fragile, dangerous hope bloom. The school's initial response was careful and clumsy, like people practicing sympathy with bad lighting. Families whispered, rumors spread, and for a while everyone looked at me like I was a character in someone else's story. That was the scariest part. I feared being blamed, feared being asked why I hadn't said anything sooner, feared Ava's mockery if she found out I'd stirred things up. But something unexpected happened when the truth started to come out. The edges of my memory that had felt jagged and lonely began to make sense. The pieces lined up. Teachers who'd always pretended everything was fine were suddenly quiet. Sam avoided me like I'd become contagious. Some friends rallied in ways that made my chest ache with gratitude. There were nights I couldn't sleep because my mind would race through every small choice I'd made, analyzing myself with the cruel precision I'd used for years. Was I brave or foolish? Did I cause this? I learned that telling the truth isn't a clean undoing of pain. It's messy and loud, and it asks you to live with the consequences, good and bad. The investigation revealed patterns, complaints that had been dismissed, whispers that never turned into action, and Mrs. Patel's defense was soft and practiced, like a script she'd been given that made mercy sound like protection. When she was finally asked to explain, she used those same words she used in class. Misunderstood, supportive, special needs, and people nodded because they wanted to believe teachers are always saints. But the evidence was stubborn. It kept coming back in texts, in small favors, in witnesses who had been too scared to speak. Standing in that meeting, when administrators looked at me and asked if I was sure, my knees shook but my voice didn't break. I said what I knew, and then I said more because silence had been my habit and I wanted to outpace it with truth. Afterward, there was a period where everything felt raw. News of the investigation leaked. Parents argued. Some students resented me for ruining someone's career. And Ava told me I'd embarrassed the family, which hurt like salt in a wound I thought had scabbed over. But for the first time in a long time, I slept without the pebble pressing into my ribs. Nia came over and we sat on my floor in our socks, and she cried and said thank you in a way that made me realize how much courage had been trapped in other people's mouths, waiting for permission. I won't lie, there were consequences. I lost friends who couldn't handle the heat of truth, and I gained the quiet respect of people who had always watched me and now saw me differently. The school made changes, new reporting procedures, required training, a review of how complaints were handled, and those measures felt small but real, like stitches in a tear. I still have flashbacks sometimes. I still wear my cardigan when I want armor. But the relief of not having to hide the thing I knew is enormous and strange, like stepping out into sunlight after always living in shade. My sister never apologized. She kept making jokes about how dramatic I was, and maybe she always will, and that's on her. What matters is that I'm not carrying it alone anymore, and the truth, messy as it is, has a weight that's different from the weight of silence. If you ever find yourself shrinking to avoid being believed, I want you to know that being seen can be terrifying and freeing at once. And that sometimes the bravest thing isn't loud heroics, but the quiet decision to stop protecting the person who hurt you by covering up for them.
I did something petty, and it spiraled into the biggest decision of my life. I told myself it would be one night, one evening, where I would not answer a single message. And that idea sounded ridiculous and small, but also oddly intoxicating, so I let it sit there like a pebble in my pocket. It felt like reclaiming a little bit of air, because for years I was the one who texted first, who said sorry first, who smoothed things over even when my throat burned from swallowing whatever I should have said. And I was tired of always being the one who made the peace while everything that bruised me stayed hidden and quiet. so I left my phone face down on the table, made tea, and watched a stupid show until the messages vibrated and flashed and nothing at all moved me. I thought of Adrian and Finn and how we'd been a triangle that sometimes felt like geometry class, arranged, polite, and useful, but mostly arranged so I wouldn't slip out of view, and when the first "you okay" came at 9, I smiled in a private, almost mean way and kept the silence like a secret. I wanted to know if anyone would miss the habit of me answering right away, if anyone would notice the small erosion of my availability, and I didn't expect much because people have lives and nights and habits, but I also didn't expect the way the silence would act as a light, making corners where people hid suddenly obvious. The second night the messages came earlier, terse and small. "Hey, are you ignoring me?" From Alina, which felt like a jab more than concern, and Caleb, "Why are you ghosting?" From Finn, which sounded accusatory, and I realized in those first few hours that my quiet wasn't only a test for them. It was a way for me to see how much of my life had been propped up by my constant presence and apologies. I kept the phone turned over because I liked the view of the table. I liked being able to choose to look. I liked the tiny power of not reflexively softening every friction. It was petty, I told myself, and that pettiness felt almost holy. I expected petty consequences, maybe a little annoyance, maybe a message that read like a cartoon about my emotional immaturity, but instead the silence made visible things I hadn't wanted to see, who replaced me with questions, who replaced me with assumptions, who replaced me with convenience. By the third evening, the house felt different. My mother moved through the kitchen in a way that suggested she expected my normal presence. My half-empty mugs, the headphones left tangled on the couch, and when I didn't answer to tell her I'd be late, she asked once without heat, then again with a note of something I couldn't recognize, a tiredness that I thought might be mine but was hers, or maybe we shared it. That small non-answer hit harder than a dramatic breakup would have, because it dragged out like a silence in a song and made the space around it vibrate with pre-existing cracks. My friends texted in group chat like nothing had happened, memes and inside jokes and a string of messages that moved like a river while I was a stone at the bottom. When someone asked, "Where's Caleb?" a different few typed quick replies that read like they were filing me away, probably studying, maybe with his mom. He always does this. The story they told about me without me in it was a version of myself I'd tolerated, small, present when needed, easy to smooth over, and that ease had been both my ticket into their lives and the thing that kept me unremarkable. I felt ridiculous and exposed. I felt seen in a way that was not tender. It spiraled because the silence was not passive. It forced other people to rearrange themselves around the vacancy, and their rearrangements were loud. Alina sent a message that read like a receipt. "If you're doing this to punish me for last week, that's childish." Adrian sent a long text at midnight that pretended to be casual but unfolded into a list of petty grievances. Things I'd said in the wrong tone, plans I'd canceled, nights I'd shown up late, that suddenly added up into a ledger I didn't know had been kept. Finn's reply was stoic and short, "Fine." Then, when I finally peeked at my phone the next day, there were 3 missed calls from cousin Zane and a voicemail from my neighbor Elias asking if everything was okay because he heard me crying through the wall the night before. That voicemail was one of those small humiliations that cuts because it's true. I'd cried quietly because being ignored, even intentionally, hurts in a particular way, the way a slow drip wears a groove in your patience. The petty thing had pulled at a loose thread, and the sweater of my life started to unravel. Not dramatically, not in a single theatrical moment, but in the slow, domestic way of things loosening when you stop doing the small maintenance work you used to do just to keep everything stable. Then the invitations stopped coming, not in one sweep, but subtly. A Saturday hike that never mentioned me in the plan, a study group for core people only with names that didn't include mine, a potluck where someone messaged to ask if they'd bring dessert, and I sat at my kitchen table watching the cursor. I felt the pattern like a bruise under skin, not sudden but undeniable, and I checked the receipts of my life. The nights I'd agreed to people's plans despite being tired, the times I'd literally gotten up in patched moods because it was easier than asking why I was always the one to give. My mother started leaving little notes in the kitchen, "Left for work, see you tonight," and those notes felt formal, like the communication of people who already assumed absence. That was the part that shook me. The structure of the world I'd built by being accommodating began to accommodate me out piece by piece because I wasn't performing what they'd situated me for. It wasn't mean, it wasn't even conscious cruelty. It was, as Adrian later told me awkwardly over coffee, inertia. People kept the habits that made them comfortable. When one gear stops turning, they either adjust or fit something else in. The decision, because by then it had become a decision, wasn't sudden, like a scene in a movie where someone slams a door and picks up a life in a bag. It was a series of small recognitions that together formed an exit route. I noticed how many of my days were scheduled around being the person who apologized first. Polite text replies at weird hours, bringing up someone's favorite takeout when they'd been moody, rearranging my entire weekend when a friend posted "need a ride." At 8 a.m., I also noticed the quiet of evenings when I didn't do that maintenance and how the silence allowed room for me to come into focus. The petty test had become a mirror showing everything I'd covered with quick kindness and older fear. The more I watched, the more the life I was living felt like a role I'd been assigned and accepted out of habit. Maybe being the conciliator was easier than asking to be seen on other terms. Maybe it was the only script I knew because it's the part people had applauded, saying sorry, smoothing, making less of things, but applause doesn't equal belonging. People applauded my small sacrifices without ever having to change their behavior. I was rewarded for disappearing. So I did something else. I asked for a weekend alone, not in a flippant text, but in a message that named how I'd been feeling and what I needed, which surprised me because the version of me who always apologized doesn't speak in sentences that begin with "I need." The replies were instructive. Alina wrote, "If you want space, fine," like it was a permission slip for me to vanish forever. Adrian offered to talk and then scheduled something for late on Sunday, hedging with convenience. Finn didn't reply for 2 days, then sent a meme and a heart, like the world could be fixed with a cartoon. My mother came by the next morning with soup and said nothing about the message I left on her table. She just sat and ate the soup, and that silence was different, soft, and patient. The worst and the best revelation was that I didn't need theatrical proof of care to know who cared. I needed people who rearranged themselves even a little, who could say, "I see you stepping back, do you want me here in a different way?" And that small request, the one that asked for different terms, was harder than any silence I'd kept. It required risking the petty power of being absent for an honest, messy ask. When the responses came, split and imperfect, I realized the only thing that had truly changed was me. The petty act had given me permission to want something else. Leaving or staying wasn't a single event anymore. It was a shape I could test against real reactions. Some people shifted, some people didn't. Some relationships bent to include a new version of me, others simply slotted in someone else. The biggest decision wasn't about packing a bag or signing a lease. It was about deciding whether to continue living in the pattern that erased me quietly and kindly, or to choose the uncomfortable work of asking for myself and letting those who couldn't meet me fall away. The pettiness had spiraled, yes, but into clarity. I could keep apologizing and being small, or I could be someone who answered on their own terms and whose absence wasn't a theatrical punishment but a boundary. I haven't fixed anything permanently. The mornings are still strange, and people still test the edges, and sometimes I still want to flip the phone and hide. But I know now that one small petty night taught me how to notice the rooms I was allowed into, and the ones I was simply tolerated in, and that knowledge, awkward, petty, and painfully useful, was the first honest step toward deciding what kind of life I wanted to stop disappearing from. My roommate next door wasn't who they said they were. I moved into the room because I hated the sound of my own thoughts at night. That sounds dramatic, I know, but it was true. The place was cheap, the hall was long, and the unit next door was supposed to stay empty for maybe a week before someone moved in. Then Caleb from the front office said they had a roommate lined up already, and I remember feeling weirdly relieved, not excited, just less alone. That was enough for me. So when the door next to mine opened that first evening and a guy with a duffel bag and a tired smile introduced himself like we were already halfway friends, I let myself believe it was going to be fine. His name was Elias, or that's what he told me. He said he was from Durban, said he was in town for work, said he'd probably keep to himself because he was not much of a people person. I liked that immediately. It felt honest. Funny how wrong that was. The first few days were nothing dramatic. Just small stuff, different answers to the same basic questions. One night he said he grew up near the coast. Another time he said he barely remembered the coast because he'd lived inland most of his life. He told me his phone was broken, then I heard it buzz in his room at 2 in the morning, over and over, like somebody was trying to reach him from the other side of the world. When I asked if everything was okay, he laughed too quickly and said, "Family stuff." That was his answer for everything. Family stuff, work stuff, private stuff. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I was being nosy because I had too much free time and not enough friends. Seriously, that's how I explained it to myself. But there was this feeling I couldn't shake, like every time he spoke, the floor underneath his words shifted half an inch. Never enough to fall, just enough to make you unsteady. The oddest part was how normal he looked. He wasn't shady in the way people are in movies. No constant lying eyes, no sneaking around in dark corners. He made coffee in the mornings. He held the door open. He asked me about class, about my mother, about whether I had eaten. He was good at sounding ordinary, maybe too good. One Thursday, I came back early from Mr. Jacobs' study group and heard voices through the thin wall. Elias was talking to someone on speaker, and for a second I thought he was arguing with a girlfriend. Then I heard him say a name I didn't know, and then another one, and then clear as day he said, "No, I'm still using Caleb's hallway key." My stomach dropped so hard I had to put my backpack down. I stood there like an idiot with my ear against the plaster, not even breathing properly. The call ended fast. A minute later his door opened. He froze when he saw me, not surprised, caught, just frozen. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I said, "Hear what?" He stared at me for a long second, then smiled like nothing had happened and went to the kitchen. That smile was worse than any confession would have been. After that, I started noticing things I should have noticed earlier. His shoes always looked new, but he claimed he barely had money. He never had visitors, yet the hallway camera log, the little light on the office monitor that the manager let me see by accident, showed people coming by late when I was out. One afternoon I found a black backpack left outside the laundry room. It was open just enough for me to see a bundle of cash, a second phone, and a notebook with names written inside in small, sharp handwriting. Not Elias, not Caleb, different names, too many names. I shouldn't have opened it. I know that, but I did. Because once you suspect something is wrong, curiosity starts feeling like survival. Inside the notebook were dates, room numbers, descriptions of people in the building, and notes like "doesn't ask questions" or "keeps lights off at night" or "possible contact through front office." My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I put everything back the way I found it, but by then I'd already seen enough to know my quiet roommate wasn't some random guy looking for work. He was watching people, maybe all of us. I confronted him that night, not bravely, just cornered and stupid and scared. I held the notebook in one hand and asked him what the hell it was. He looked at it, then at me, and something in his face changed. The friendly version disappeared, not all at once, just enough to show me there had been another person under it the whole time. He said very calmly, "You weren't supposed to find that." That was it, no denial, no panic. I asked who he really was. He sat down on my bed like he belonged there and said his name wasn't Elias, and it wasn't even the worst lie. He said he'd been using the room to stay off the radar while he settled something with a man who'd been looking for him for months. He said the other phone was for people I didn't need to know about. He said the names in the notebook were people he'd observed because he had to. I remember laughing once just because my brain couldn't fit all of it together. I asked him if he was dangerous. He looked at me for a long time and said, "Only if you make me be." That line still makes my skin crawl. The worst part, though, wasn't that he'd lied, was that I'd let him. I had ignored every odd detail because I was relieved someone was there, because the room felt less empty with another set of footsteps in the hallway, because I didn't want to go back to hearing my own breathing at night. That's the ugly truth. I kept choosing comfort over instinct. After I found out, I barely slept. Every sound in the hall made my chest lock up. I started noticing how often he watched the window, how he never used the same route twice when leaving the building, how he flinched when the front office called his unit number. Then one night around 1 a.m. there was a knock on my door, not his, mine, 3 slow knocks. I stood there in the dark with my hand over my mouth while another voice, male and low, asked, "Elias, you in there?" The hallway went dead silent. I could hear my own pulse. Then I heard Elias behind his door, moving fast, a drawer opening, something metallic hitting the floor. The man outside knocked again, harder this time. I did the dumbest thing possible and looked through the peephole. There was a stranger in the hall wearing a plain jacket, one hand in his pocket, staring straight at my door like he knew exactly where I was standing. I backed away so fast I hit the dresser. The stranger said, "Tell him we're done hiding." Then he left. No shouting, no chasing, just gone. When I opened Elias' door after that, he was already packing, fast, efficient, like this had all happened before. He didn't look at me when he said, "I need to go before they come back." I asked who they were. He said, "People who don't leave loose ends." Then he paused, finally meeting my eyes, and added, "You should leave too." I moved out 2 days later, barely spoke to anyone. The office said Elias had checked out before dawn and left no forwarding address. Of course he did. I still don't know who he was really running from or what he'd been doing while he stayed next door, and part of me wishes I didn't know any of it. But the thing I can't stop thinking about is how long I knew something was off and still stayed quiet because I was scared of being alone in that room again. That's what gets me, not the lie. The fact that I almost preferred it to the silence. I stayed quiet for years, then finally told the truth about my mother's secret. I remember the sound of the kettle the night before I said it, the small, ordinary clatter like a clock winding, like everything waiting for permission to move, and I can still feel how ridiculous that is because the thing I said later wasn't about the kettle at all. It was about the shape of our house and the ways people in it learned not to look at certain corners. So when Mom laughed into her mug and asked if I wanted more tea, I almost said nothing, and then I didn't. I told her the one line I'd been carrying like a pebble in my pocket for years, the sentence that felt like it would crumble if I kept it, and when it came out my throat hurt and my hands shook, but the words were ordinary and blunt and true, and that was the point, to make them ordinary so they couldn't be used like a weapon anymore. For years I'd watched her pack sadness into small things, closing a cupboard with a little more force than needed, making an extra sandwich she didn't finish, telling a story and cutting it off halfway because someone at the doorway cleared their throat. So I learned to measure silence by the subtle changes in her breath, and because I was good at being small, I learned to disappear into silence too. School was a place I could be other things, a place of loud sneakers and jokes where no one asked the kind of question that had the power to break the room, and I liked that safety. I liked pretending the world had rules I could play by, but home had its own gravity, and there were nights where the whole house hummed like a held note, and I felt it pressing into my ribs. I kept quiet because naming would feel like betrayal. Everyone in the family knew, or at least suspected, and there was an unspoken agreement to fold the thing back into itself like a map you don't open in public. You could say it once and then there'd be a different kind of listening, eyes that looked at you in a new way, pity that would live in the kitchen like a second light bulb, and pity was worse than silence to me because pity asked for explanations I couldn't give. The thing about secretive sadness is it teaches you to be a cartographer of absence. You learn the roots of avoidance. You learn which jokes will steer conversations away. You memorize which songs make her quieter, and which movies make her laugh because those were the safe ports on the map. So I walked around inside that map for years, smiling, answering homework questions, pretending not to notice the way our neighbor put the recycling bin out a little earlier, as if time could tidy what words wouldn't touch. One night, though, the pressure caught me off guard, not because something dramatic happened, but because a small, private fracture widened until it couldn't be ignored. Cousin Zane came over and said something careless, like a match dropped near dry leaves, about how some families keep things together and how others just fall apart, and Mom's face folded in a way I'd only seen twice before, and that tiny shift made me feel like I was watching a glass bowl slip off a table in slow motion. I remember thinking, irrationally, that if I didn't hold my breath, the bowl would shatter, and I'd be the one to sweep the pieces. I didn't know then that the bowl had already been cracked inside. I only knew the air in the room changed and my chest tightened, and something in me snapped toward speech, because the place where I'd been storing the sentence finally felt heavier than the fear of what would happen if I opened it. So I said it not in a dramatic, cinematic confession, but like I was naming an object across a room. Mom, the thing about Dad, and then I said the thing. Saying it felt like opening a window in winter. Cold air rushed in and the room smelled the way it always had, but also different, as if someone had moved the furniture and now there were new shadows. She didn't react the way I'd rehearsed. There was no loud screaming or immediate collapse, just a slow exhale I hadn't heard before, a sound that was almost a laugh and almost a sob, and then she walked to the sink and bent over like she was folding something too big into a small drawer. The rest of the night was quiet in a new register. We moved through routines with the knowledge between us acting like a third person at the table. I thought for a ridiculous second that by saying it I was doing damage, that I'd be the one to split the family cleanly in two, but what followed wasn't neat rupture, it was awkward reorientation. Mom started telling me small, trailing stories she hadn't told me because she hadn't been able to place them, and when she spoke her voice wasn't the same guarded tone I'd known. It was softer, like a record played at the right speed for the first time in years. I asked questions I had practiced like incantations, and some were answered, some weren't, and the ones left hanging felt less like holes and more like windows you could choose to open later. Saying it didn't fix the years, which is important to say because no confession is a magic eraser. There were practical things to deal with, calls to make, old promises and explanations that had to be cleaned up, and there were long evenings when the silence returned, but it wasn't the old silence that swallowed whole conversations like they never happened. It was a silence that waited politely, as if it had been taught new manners. I noticed something else after that night. I could breathe without feeling like I was betraying someone by taking up space. That small freedom was stealthy. It didn't roar into existence. It arrived in tiny ways, smaller arguments where I didn't walk away, the ability to laugh at a joke without the guilty aftertaste, the courage to tell a teacher why I was late without inventing stories. Other people noticed too, or maybe they always noticed and just didn't say it. Finn asked if I was okay, and I didn't have to practice the answer. I just said yeah and meant it, and that felt like a small miracle. Mom didn't become suddenly untroubled. She carried sadness the way some people carry heirlooms, carefully with an obvious weight, but she also started to say things that used to vanish if anyone looked at them too long. Once she told me about a time she had wanted to quit her job and run away for a week to a place she couldn't name, and I listened without pretending to understand everything, and that was enough. People ask me now if I regret telling her, as if silence was a shield that could have kept us safe, and I always say no because silence wasn't protective. It was a kind of imprisonment that everyone agreed to live in to avoid conflict. Saying the truth didn't make everything tidy. It made things honest, and honesty, messy as it can be, gave us a map to walk by instead of one we were always folding up and hiding. If I had one thing to tell someone who is sitting on a pebble of a sentence the way I did, it's this. The danger isn't just in speaking, it's in the way silence reshapes you to hold the secret instead of letting it go. Speaking made me less suitable for other people's pity and more available to my own life. There are nights when the old reflexes still come, the tightness at a joke that hits too close, the instinct to tuck the thing back into my pocket, but they are shorter now, like shadows that pass instead of settling. And in that change I found a kind of permission, to be small sometimes, to be loud sometimes, and to know that either is allowed without the quiet collapsing the room.
My neighbor next door wasn't who they said they were. I started noticing the little things first. The kind of stuff you almost talk yourself out of because it sounds stupid when you say it out loud. Like how every time I cried in my apartment, there'd be a knock at my door 10 minutes later, always soft, always timed like they'd been waiting for the exact moment I'd fall apart. Or how a cup of tea would show up outside my door when I hadn't told a single soul I was having one of those nights. At first I thought, okay, maybe I'm being paranoid. Maybe the hallway carried sound better than I realized. Maybe some sweet old neighbor was just trying to be kind. I wanted it to be simple. I really did. But simple wasn't what this was. The person next door was this quiet, private type who introduced themselves as Adrian, kept their head down, and smiled like they didn't want to take up too much space in the world. They said they worked odd hours and liked to keep to themselves. Honestly, I respected that. I know what it feels like to want to disappear sometimes. So I didn't push. I just smiled back, carried my groceries in, and kept living my life. Except they kept knowing things. Not obvious things. Private things. The kind of things no normal neighbor should know unless they were listening from the other side of the wall or watching me through some crack in my routine. One night, I came home after crying in my car for 20 minutes because I'd gotten a voicemail from my mother that sent me straight back into old memories I'd spent years trying not to touch. I sat on my kitchen floor shaking and said nothing to anyone. 10 minutes later, there was a little paper bag at my door with tissues, chocolate, and a note that said, "You don't have to answer the phone tonight." No name, no explanation, just that. I remember sitting there, staring at it, feeling my skin go cold. That wasn't kindness anymore. That was precision. I started paying attention. I started timing the hallway noises, checking my peephole, pretending I was asleep when I was. And still, every time I thought I'd caught something, it slipped away. Adrian was never there when I opened the door, never caught in the act, just their apartment with the closed blinds and that same quiet light under the frame. Then I noticed other things. They never got mail. Or rather, I never saw them bring in mail. No delivery apps. No visitors. No trash. No random noise from a life happening on the other side of the wall. It was like the apartment existed to hold a person-shaped silence. I asked them once, trying to sound casual, if they'd lived there long. They gave me this small, almost embarrassed smile and said, "Long enough." That was it. I should have let it go. I know, but I didn't. One evening, I was leaving for work and saw a box by their door with a return label from a place 2 provinces over, and the name on it wasn't Adrian. It was Daniel. I stood there with my keys in my hand, feeling my heart slam around in my chest, because the face on the door had gone from neighbor to stranger in a second. When they stepped into the hall and saw me looking, they froze, just for a beat. Then they smiled that same careful smile and said, "That's not mine." It was such a clean lie that I almost believed it. Almost. But the more I looked, the more the whole thing started to crack. One night, the power in my unit went out, and I ended up in the hallway with my phone light on, because I hate sitting in the dark when my head's already full of bad thoughts. Adrian came out, asked if I was okay, and for one strange second, they looked less like a quiet neighbor and more like someone bracing for impact. Their eyes kept dropping to my wrist, to the old scar there, the one from when I was 14, and too scared to tell anyone what had happened until years later. Nobody in that building should have known that scar meant anything. Nobody. I backed away from them, and they just stood there, hands empty, looking wrecked. Not dangerous. Not then. Just wrecked. So I did what any sane person would do when I was terrified and curious, and honestly, kind of lonely all at once. I started digging. I called the landlord. I checked public records. I asked the woman downstairs if she'd ever known anyone named Adrian. She laughed and said, "Honey, that unit was rented under a different name before you moved in." That hit me like a punch. I asked what name. She frowned and said, "I think it was Daniel." My stomach dropped. Daniel, the name on the box. The name that kept showing up in tiny, impossible ways. I went back to my apartment and sat there with my laptop open, shaking so hard I could barely type. I found an old obituary, not for Adrian, for Daniel. Same age range, same general background, same face, if you knew what to look for in the grainy photo. And buried in a local forum post from years earlier was a mention of a case, one my family had tried so hard to erase from our lives that I almost didn't recognize it at first. My worst memories. The reason I still slept with the hallway light on. The reason I hated certain voices, certain colognes, certain knocks at the door. Daniel had been connected to it, not as some random bystander, as family, as someone who had changed their name and moved close enough to watch me live with the aftermath. I wish I could say I screamed or called the police right away. I didn't. I walked across the hall and knocked. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely keep it raised. When Adrian opened the door, I said the name. Daniel. Their face went blank. Then they stepped back and let me in like they'd been waiting for this exact moment for years. Inside, the apartment was almost empty except for a few boxes. An old framed photo turned face down, and a notebook full of dates. My dates, my bad days, my crying nights. The nights I'd fallen apart. I felt sick. I asked why. Why me? Why lie? Why stay? They sat down like their legs couldn't hold them anymore and said they hadn't come back to hurt me. They said they came back because they saw me once, years ago, and realized I was carrying the same fear they'd spent their whole life pretending didn't exist. They said they invented the name Adrian because Daniel was the name attached to the damage, and they couldn't stand being that person anymore. I hated them for saying it like that, for making their guilt sound almost human. But then they looked up and admitted they'd been checking on me because they knew what no one else did. That sometimes the person who hurt you leaves behind a whole life of silence, and you end up alone inside it. I should have felt only disgust. I did feel it, a lot of it. But I also felt something else, ugly and confusing and impossible to admit. Relief. Not because they were innocent. They were. Not because what they did was okay. It was. But because for months, maybe years, somebody had been close enough to notice when I was breaking, and close enough to leave something at my door before the dark got too loud. I still haven't forgiven them. I don't know if I will. I changed the locks. I saved every note. I kept the tea bag once. It's stupid, I know. But there was this one night after everything came out, when I sat in my kitchen and looked at that unopened bag and thought about how wrong it was that comfort had come wrapped around a lie. Then I thought about how I hadn't been alone when I thought I was. That's what messed me up the most. Not the spying, not the fake name, not even the connection to my past. It was the sick, twisted fact that the person I feared was also the person who saw me most clearly when I was falling apart. Seriously, I still don't know what that makes them. All I know is that now, every time I hear a knock in the hallway, my whole body goes rigid. And every time I don't hear one, part of me still wonders who's out there, standing close enough to know my pain, and whether that's mercy or another kind of trap. I found out my girlfriend was using my depression as entertainment. It started with little things, the kind you almost talk yourself out of noticing. A weird pause when I got quiet, a smile that hung around a second too long. My girlfriend, Tasha, would put her arm around me when we were alone and tell me I was safe with her, that she got me, that she knew what it was like to feel too heavy for the room. I believed her. I really did. That was the worst part. Because when somebody looks at you like you're not a burden for once, you hand them pieces of yourself you don't give to anyone else. I told her about the days I couldn't get out of bed. I told her about the nights I stared at the ceiling and felt like I was sinking through it. I told her because I trusted her with the softest parts of me, and she held them like they meant something. At least, that's what I thought. The first crack showed up at a house hangout with some of her friends. I was sitting on the couch, quiet like usual, and one of her friends said something about me being tired. Before I could answer, Tasha laughed and said, "Yeah, that's just Amina. She'll disappear into the floor if you don't keep checking on her." Everybody chuckled. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do, but my face got hot right away. Not because she'd said I was quiet, because she said it like I was a cute little joke she'd rehearsed. Like my sadness was part of the entertainment package. I told myself I was being too sensitive. Seriously, that's what I did. I went home and kept replaying it until I could find a version that didn't hurt. Then it happened again and again. We were at lunch one day, and she told Lena about how I go full ghost mode when I'm depressed. Another time, she mentioned how I texted her at 2 a.m. once because I couldn't sleep and thought I was having a panic attack. She said it with this little laugh, like she was sharing something quirky and harmless. The people around us always reacted the same way. Awkward smiles, sympathetic nods, a quick change of subject. Nobody ever looked at her like she was doing something wrong, because she kept her voice soft and her face concerned. That was the trick. She made my pain sound like a sweet story, a little dramatic, a little sad, but still safe enough to say out loud. I started paying attention after that, really paying attention. And what I found made my stomach turn. When I was with her alone, she was all warmth. She'd ask if I'd eaten, if I'd slept, if I wanted her to stay on the phone while I tried to calm down. She'd call me baby and tell me I didn't have to hide from her. But the second other people were around, she got this different shine in her eyes. She'd bring up my rough days like she was opening a gift. The concern was always there, but it felt fake in the same instant she knew an audience was listening. It was like she liked being the girl who handled the broken one, like it made her look kind, special, better. So I tested it. One night, I texted her that I was having a bad spiral and didn't feel safe being alone with my thoughts. She replied fast, all tenderness and heart emojis, saying she was here, that she was on her way if I needed her. My chest loosened a little. Then I saw her post a story less than 10 minutes later from a restaurant with her friends, laughing over drinks. No call, no follow-up, no check-in, nothing. I waited. Maybe she was about to leave. Maybe she was texting and driving was unsafe. Maybe there was some explanation that didn't make me feel stupid. But the message that came back hours later was, "Sorry, babe, got caught up." That was it. Not one question about whether I was okay. The next time I was in a bad place and texted her, I watched what happened around me. Not with her, but with me. How quickly the panic left when I realized nobody else knew. How carefully she had built this version of herself as my protector, while doing the bare minimum when it counted. She wanted credit for caring, not the work of it. She liked the story more than the person. I kept hearing her voice in my head, the same voice she used when she'd tell people, "She's just sensitive right now," or "I have to be extra careful with her," like I was a fragile little thing she carried around in her purse. It made me feel sick, not only because she was exposing me, but because she was shrinking me, turning my pain into a personality trait she could laugh about, manage, and show off. And every time I gave her another chance, I was teaching her I'd stay quiet. The confrontation came on a rainy night. We were in her room, and I asked her straight out why my worst moments kept coming up in front of her friends. She blinked at me like I'd asked something ridiculous. Then she laughed. A tiny laugh. The kind that makes your skin go cold. She said she was just being honest, that couples shared things, that I was acting like she'd betrayed me. She even told me I should be grateful she cared enough to notice when I was struggling. That sentence, wow, that one almost broke something in me on the spot. Because there it was, plain as day. My pain had become a way for her to prove how good she was. I asked her why her concern vanished whenever nobody was watching. She rolled her eyes and said I was reading into everything because of my depression. She actually used my depression as proof that I couldn't trust my own judgment. That's when I understood what she'd been doing all along. It wasn't love. It was control dressed up as kindness. It was emotional armor. She got to be the caring girlfriend, the patient one, the saintly one, while I was the unstable one whose feelings could be talked over. I left that night. No big speech, no dramatic scene, just me grabbing my bag, my keys, and the little bit of self-respect I had left. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely unlock the car. I cried all the way home, not because I missed her, because I felt embarrassed for how long I'd let her turn my private suffering into a story she could tell at parties. After that, I stopped answering her texts. I blocked her friends too, because I didn't want to hear how worried she was or how I was misunderstanding her. I told Lena what happened, and she went quiet for a long time before saying she'd noticed Tasha always seemed to light up whenever there was a chance to talk about how much she did for me. That helped in a messed up way. It meant I wasn't imagining it. It meant the weird feeling in my gut had been real from the start. I'm not going to pretend it healed me overnight. It didn't. I still have bad nights. I still get that awful feeling when someone seems too kind too fast. But I also know this now. Real care doesn't need an audience. Real love doesn't use your pain as proof of its own goodness. And if somebody only feels close to you when they can turn your hurt into a story, then they don't actually want you. They want the role you play in their life. I gave her my worst days, and she turned them into applause. Never again.
My neighbor next door wasn't who they said they were. I saw Elias for the first time on a Tuesday when the light was thin and the street smelled like rain and cut grass, and he said hi with the kind of practiced casualness that made me think he'd rehearsed the word in a mirror. He smiled, closed his door, and left the hallway quieter than before. At first he was just polite, small talk at the mailbox, a wave when our bins were out, and I liked that because my life at the time felt like a collection of small, manageable silences. I was finishing my last year at school, drifting through shifts at the cafe, and a neighbor who kept to himself seemed like a kind of safety. Then came the little wrong things, parcels with my name but his handwriting sprawled across the sticky label, a bicycle chained to his stair rail that he'd move at odd hours, and once I found his door ajar late at night with the chain clicked but the deadbolt untouched, like someone wanted the appearance of being careful without the work of it. Those things should have stayed small, but they multiplied, and I started keeping a list in my head because lists steady me when other stuff doesn't. I noticed too that people he knew, an older woman who walked her terrier, the boy from down the corridor who played guitar, called him Elias, but once I heard someone on the phone call him by a different name, like a slip that had nowhere to land. And whenever I asked anything that mattered, where he worked, what he did before moving here, he'd shift, give me a joke, or walk away with that practiced casualness. I told myself I was poking at nothing because teenagers poke at things to feel alive. But then one day a parcel arrived with the name Noah printed across it and a wrong address sticker, and I opened it because it was heavy with books, and inside was a passport tucked between the pages with a photo that looked like Elias but not. There were different freckles, a different cut of jaw. The name on the passport was Luca Ricardo, and suddenly the small wrong things were not playful but oddly arranged clues. I kept the passport in my pocket for an hour, then slid it back under the books and left the parcel by his door, because what do you do when reality doesn't match the person you wave to in the hallway? You test it, but you also preserve the boundary. I began watching, which is a terrible thing to admit because watching feels like gossip and fear made it feel urgent. I learned his routines. He watered a single plant at the window every Thursday. He played the same song quietly, always the same strain of piano, at 2 in the morning, and once he counted the coins in his jar aloud like someone rehearsing how to be poor and careful. There was tenderness in those moments, which made the other moments sharper. The papers he shredded at midnight, the string of disconnected SIM cards in a drawer I saw once when the door had been frankly unlocked, the locked box under his bed that hummed when he pressed his ear to it, like a private engine. I wanted to confront him when I found a different wallet tucked under his mattress on a morning I was supposed to be at the library. The wallet was full of receipts from cities I'd never been to and a photograph of an apartment in a place where he'd never said he'd lived. But for every suspicion I gathered, there were counterweights, small things that felt human and honest. He'd leave sticky notes on the stairwell for Mrs. Sheriff when she forgot her shopping list. He'd patch the town notice board when it ripped in the wind, and once he fixed my cat's paw with an old sock in a careful knot and then pretended he'd done nothing. So I kept the list, and I kept my mouth shut, which is a cowardly patience grown in someone who both wants and fears answers. The first real break came with a telephone call at 2 in the morning. I heard his voice from the hallway when I was up, staring at the ceiling, and he said only 3 words into the receiver. "It's me, finally," and his hands were shaking so badly the phone almost left his ear. The next day he was gone for 36 hours and came back with a new duffel and a different cologne, or maybe it was the same cologne worn to do a different job. His eyes were thinner, like someone who'd been wearing a mask that finally fit too well. I found another passport that week, hidden in the lining of a jacket he'd hung in the closet that smelled faintly of sea salt. This one had a different name again, and a stamp from a country I could barely place. I started to understand that he wasn't just lying about small things. He'd layered lives until it was hard to tell which one was the real architecture and which one was scaffolding. I asked myself why anyone would build like that. There are stories about people who remake themselves to escape something unbearable, stories about survival and reinvention, but there were details that didn't fit those tidy arcs. There were expiration dates on the lies, things kept too neat to be survival, empty train timetables filled with pencil marks that said maybe. And once I glimpsed the neighbor's ledger tucked under his mattress, a book of names and small notations like Tuesday, small lie, or April, new number. The ledger made my hands sweat. It read like an experiment in being someone else, carefully recorded. When I finally confronted him, it happened like a rupture. I'd been carrying the passport in my jacket as if it were evidence, and I found him at the stairwell patching the notice board with his sticky notes. I said his name, Elias, and he looked up with a face that I realized had practiced surprise so often it had become second nature. "Do you ever get tired?" I asked, ridiculous and human, because that's what people who watch ask when they want a confession but are scared of the consequences. He laughed. It sounded hollow, or maybe it was just a laugh I'd misread before. He asked me to come up, and in his kitchen the light was the color of an old photograph, and there were stacks of old passports, clothing tags, a shoebox of different business cards with different accents, and in the middle of the table a letter he'd never sent. He told me the story in pieces that fit and didn't fit. He was born somewhere that didn't like the shape of him. He left because of a list we both understood but never said, a quiet catalog of what you can change about yourself to keep breathing. He said each new name was a shelter, not a game, and that the ledger was his map, kept the way someone would keep a prayer book when prayer was all they had. He said he had done damage, hurt people who trusted him, traded intimacies for safety, and he looked like a boy telling the truth for the first time. I wanted to be angry, to throw the passports at him like proof, but I also wanted to sit and hold whatever face he offered me. The complicated part is that he was both liar and frightened man, performer and someone exhausting himself into silence. He'd made a life out of fragments because the whole life had been dangerous, and that was worse, maybe, than the lies themselves. In the end, he told me to leave because admitting anything makes it harder to keep the roof over your head when roofing is the only thing you know how to do. I left, and for weeks I watched him less because there was a kind of mercy and unintrusive respect. I watched instead to make sure he was still breathing, which is a strange, private kind of watch. Once, months later, he moved out in the haze of a morning that tasted like lemon and petrol, and he left a note folded under his plant. "I am sorry for the things that cracked us." I kept the note even though I tried not to. I still have the ledger in a box under my bed, and sometimes I take it out and run my fingers across the penciled names, as if seeing them will teach me the difference between making a person up and making yourself small enough to survive. People close to you can be strangers, yes, but they can also be people carrying whole countries inside their pockets. And when the doors they build are finally opened, you have to decide whether you're stepping back or stepping in.